I'm glad to have with me my wife, Debbie. She can tell you that I am technically challenged. If it wasn't for her and my friend and colleague, Paul Mascarella, none of this would have been possible. I'd be up here talking to you the old-fashioned way. Thanks to Paul for the nifty PowerPoint presentation. Okay, here's the issue. Is there an increased risk developing breast cancer associated with abortion? Candidly, as I'm proving once again, I am technically challenged.
No, you're doing great.
Okay,
Is that good?
all right,
We'll kill this thing yet.
okay,
Okay,
Good.
guy.
sorry about that. Is there an increased risk of developing breast cancer associated with abortion? The literature is divided. The question is, why is it divided? We're going to touch on that somewhat. And if there is a link, what are the legal implications? Well, I'll tell you right now, the legal implications are, what is a doctor's duty to disclose in recommending a procedure? If, in fact, there is a link between abortion and breast cancer is serious business, and a doctor has an obligation to tell their patients that this link exists. If the science doesn't support it, then a doctor has no obligation to do so. That doesn't mean that there is no nexus. It just means that the science doesn't support it, therefore there's no obligation on the doctor to present it. I think there's good reason to question the current state or the current accepted state of the science. I'm not really going to comment on that, but we'll see where this takes us. First things first, who, what, and why. Who am I and who am I not, personally and professionally? You're going to get to know me just a little bit. What I'll do and not do programmatically, why we should bother practically. So who am I personally? I'm James Rainbolt, and I'm a Christian. I'm a husband and father of 5 children and 1 rebellious dog named Max. Who am I not personally? Not a disinterested party. I have a dog in this fight. I am unapologetically pro-life and anti-abortion. Who I am not professionally. I'm not a medical doctor. You just heard from Dr. Davenport. That means I'm not really going to comment much on the science. I'm not a mathematician, a statistician, epidemiologist. I received a degree in biology from Biola University a million years ago, but that really doesn't put me in a league to comment on what the studies show or fail to show. I'm not a medical researcher. Nor do I play either on TV. Who I am professionally. You've heard a little bit. I was admitted to practice law in California in 1981. Several years ago, I took an exam, got a bunch of references from other attorneys that knew me, and became board certified by the National Board of Trial Advocacy and Civil Litigation, a distinction of which I'm proud. There you got it. What I'm going to do. Compare how it is being presented with other notable cases, this ABC link, what we can say about it. Dr. Davenport mentioned how the tobacco industry morphed some of the data, at least that I took that to be one of her inferences, and I'll comment briefly on that. Expose the cracks in the case. This isn't going to be in depth. We've only got 30 minutes, and I'd really need to spend a great deal of time with a credible scientist to be able to really give that talk in depth. But we're going to touch on some things. What I'm not going to do, I'm not going to contradict the alleged science. I will question it, but I'm not going to contradict it. I'm not going to extend any benefit of the doubt regarding the truthful conduct by designated experts. It was so helpful to this point that Dr. Davenport showed you the slide from Nature magazine that showed the candor of some scientists whose findings had been altered as a result of pressure from on high. By the way, in preparing this report, I came across a report from the Government Accountability Office that showed that between 2002 and 2009, One of the entities known as Planned Parenthood, and there's several that go by that general moniker, but one of those agencies received $657.1 million in tax dollars between 2002 and 2007. So there's a lot of money in this game. I'm not going to confuse what is claimed or believed, the assertions, assumptions, probabilities, hypotheses, all that stuff. We'll come back to that. We're going to talk somewhat about the credibility of the people that are at the fore of this debate. Okay, and this is just for your viewing pleasure. We're going to talk about ails. Sounds kind of like AIDS or what may ail you. What is ails? It stands for abortion-induced legal schizophrenia. So I don't want this to sound too much like a pep rally, but I think there's a basis for this sort of anagram. Okay, pathogen. We're gonna move forward in presenting this as though we were diagnosing a disease. And then I'm going to switch back to being an attorney in just a minute, but for now I'm playing doctor. The portion in ALS is abortion rights. The target, those affected, is traditional Judeo-Christian values in Western civilization. This whole problem didn't start with the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1973. That's what I'm inferring with this statement. It started long before that. If you want to go back to Margaret Sanger and the roots of Planned Parenthood, probably even before that, the eugenics movement that I think goes back at least into the mid-19th century. Acquisition means, in other words, how do you catch the disease? By biased media and politically correct court decisions and legislation. Contagion carriers, compromised PC/PC. I thought this was just interesting. It humored me, so I hope it humors you. PC can be either politically correct or pro-choice, either way. So the contagion or carriers are compromised PC/PC hosts. Presentation. The logical, legal confusion and inconsistency, dissension is met with patronization, condescension, and ostracism. You saw at least some inference or evidence of that in Dr. Davenport's presentation, where she said that results were being hidden. If there was a result or an implication to be made from the findings that was contrary to PC standards, then it somehow got overlooked or silenced. Progress or infection distribution, it's pandemic, it's everywhere. No doubt there are children represented by the adults here that, truth be known, are supportive of abortion rights and see nothing wrong with it. Prognosis, near term, advancing legal confusion and inconsistency with invasive systemic creep and failure to thrive. All true. Prognosis, long-term legal morbidity, incoherence, and immobility determination. In other words, you die, the culture dies. Okay, let's talk about this one. Where do we see this confusion? Well, there's a lot of talk on the abortion rights side of the debate about the mental health of the mother. By the way, back in the day when Operation Rescue was in full swing, I represented literally hundreds of pro-lifers who were arrested for blocking clinic doors and doing such things. And some of what I'll say here in the next minute or two has its roots in conversations that I had with judges, with DAs, and prosecutors in the course of that experience. The mental health of the mother, we would argue to the court and to the prosecuting agencies that the mental health of the mother was a risk that was not being disclosed. And uniformly, without exception, that argument went absolutely nowhere. It was not considered. Now, on the other side, and here's where you have this little paradox happening, this inconsistency in the thinking, if the mental health of the mother might conceivably be harmed by telling them in advance of the abortion that there may be a mental, emotional downside on the other side of the divide there, you can't tell them that. On the other hand, if the mental health of the mother is something that disposes them to the procedure, that being abortion, it's okay. In other words, if going to term with your pregnancy and delivering a child may somehow adversely affect the mother's mental health, that is a factor mitigating in favor of abortion. But you can't talk about the other side. That to me is just disingenuous. It's unfair. Rights and safety of the unborn. There's a lot of talk about what's good for the unborn. The funny thing is that the mother can terminate that life up until delivery. So how is it that a mother's convenience or supposed mental health trumps the very life of the infant? Free speech. Oh, here's a good one. I can remember DAs telling me that if we would just confine our activities to what the First Amendment allowed, just talk to the people and everything will be okay. We don't have a problem with that. I can tell you that it's a problem now. You end up finding yourself confined. Here's one case. It happened close by. Long Beach Community College. It consists of about 1 million square feet of campus. Some pro-life activists were on campus in this quad area. It's an open green belt. And one of the deans came out and told them they had to leave. The only way they could be there is if they had a permit, which, by the way, they could not get that day. Who knows why? But they weren't allowed to get the permit that day. They had to get the permit on Tuesday, come back on Wednesday, for instance. So he wanted them to leave. And, oh, by the way, after you get the permit, we've got 1 million square feet of campus, and that's not considering the vertical square footage. That's just the flat, God-made-it square footage of the campus. You have to confine your free speech to this free speech zone, which consists of about 200 square feet behind a block fence. So, there you have it. Be a hero, save a whale. If any of you are old-timers in the pro-life movement, you remember that. I always loved that. In other words, we value life, we value the environment, and that's the way it is. The abortion distortion, that's really more or less the sum total of what I've already said. It does happen. It seems that it happens even in the science. Okay, potential contagion carriers, the National Institute of Health. I think there's good reason to at least be concerned about the truth and the candor and the scientific integrity of the National Institute of Health. National Cancer Institute. The American Congress of Gynecologists and Obstetricians. All these entities say that the evidence well establishes the fact that there is no increased risk as a result of an abortion. Every one of them says that. Dr. Mads Melby. Dr. Mads Melby, you saw a reference, if you were noticing, paying attention to it, in at least one of the slides that Dr. Davenport presented. He's a Danish doctor, probably a very nice man, but he did a study in 1999 that was one of the flagship studies to show that demonstrate that all the other studies were flawed and that there wasn't any abortion breast cancer link. Dr. Louise Brinton. Her name was also on one of the previous slides shown by Dr. Davenport. She was a senior epidemiologist, or perhaps still is, a senior epidemiologist with the National Cancer Institute or the National Institute of Health, and was responsible for organizing and making assignments in this 2003 workshop that occurred during 3 days in February of 2003. The upshot of that conference was that it was well established. Means doesn't acknowledge that there's any conflict in the evidence. Their official statement was that it was well established that there was no abortion breast cancer link. And she was one of the principal organizers, as I'm given to understand, of that effort and signed on. However, and I think it's important, this is an aside, I think it's important that we not slander anybody or attribute things to them that are simply not true. Dr. Louise Bren, don't know her, haven't really done the research, but there's reason to think that maybe she's had a change of heart. She did a study in 2009, which again Dr. Davenport referenced, along with Dr. Janet Dowling. And as part of that study, one of the things that they noted, there's a whole team of people that are doing this research and signing on the paper. The paper draws a connection between breast cancer and abortion. So maybe she's had an awakening, a change of heart or something. But anyway, these are some of the key players in this debate. Not all the players, but some of them that came up in the research that I did. Here's the National Institute of Health. By the way, the National Cancer Institute is a subdivision of the National Institute of Health. Their official position is women who have had an induced abortion have the same risk of breast cancer as other women. This is a quote. You can go to their website. You'll find it. And they claim that this is well established. But here's the rationales for the NIH, stands for National Institute of Health. Here's the rationale that they offer. A few retrospective studies reported in the mid-90s suggested that the induced abortion, the deliberate ending of a pregnancy, was associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. However, Dr. Joel Bren, you heard his name came up previously. This is what he had to say. 17 out of 23 studies, it may be 18 out of 23 studies, I may have my facts wrong, reported a positive association. So 18 out of 23 doesn't exactly sound like a few retrospective studies to me. Dr. Joel Bren, by the way, received his undergraduate degree in biology from Yale University and a PhD from New York University, and he teaches at Baruch College in New York City, or did. He may still be there, just don't know. Their next rationale was a key limitation, referring to these previous studies, was their reliance on self-reporting of medical history information by the study participants, which can introduce a bias. Now, this bias goes by a number of names, recall bias probably being the one that's most commonly seen in their literature. Problem with that is that Dr. Janet Dowling, now she was also a professor at the University of Washington in their School of Public Health. I don't think anybody would accuse her of being a pro-life activist. She's, I think by all counts, a credible scientist that's just out there to gather the facts. I may be mistaken about that, but that's the impression that I have. Remember, they're saying that the retrospective studies that showed there was a connection between breast cancer and abortion suffered from this recall bias, except that the NIH spent good money with Dr. Dowling back in 1994 to do a study, and as part of that study, they examined the phenomenon of recall bias, specifically in this context. That being whether there's a connection between abortion and breast cancer. And she found that there was none. So, I mean, what do you say about that? Okay, the litigation. And again, this has to do with informed consent. If a doctor knows that there is a nexus between abortion and breast cancer, he has an obligation under the law to disclose that fact to his patients when he recommends a procedure or refuses to recommend a procedure. It's information that a patient has a right to know. Well, there have been some cases where this has been tested, and I'd say tested successfully. There's at least one case in Australia. There's another case in Pennsylvania where the doctors settled out of court. I know that probably annoys some of you, those darn lawyers driving up the cost of everything. But anyway, perhaps this is an example of us redeeming ourselves. Informed consent. those cases all had to do with the doctor's obligation to tell the patient about this risk. Now, this is not a legal statement of informed consent, but it certainly catches the essence of it. And I chose this in the next slide because this is found in a report of the task force sponsored by the National Institute of Health Office of Research on Women's Health. Ironically, this report came out in January 2003. Their workshop that we've talked about, where they found that there was no abortion cancer link, was the following month. And they were concerned about their research subjects and their consent being genuinely given to participate in these research studies. So this is what one of the participants in that study had to say on the subject of informed consent. He says there are 3 essential elements to the informed consent process, and then the subject, okay. The subject, that being the participant or the patient, must have all the relevant information. Certainly if increased breast cancer risk, that would be relevant, I would think. Must have the capacity to give consent. In other words, they have to be in their right mind, understand the issues that they're evaluating, be of age to consent. And must be free from coercion. Now this free from coercion thing here, this is really interesting. This is what he went on to, or what they went on to say about informed consent. Regarding freedom from coercion, one must understand the nuances of coercion. Overt coercion is relatively easy to identify, but subtle coercion is much more difficult to grasp. I think it's fair to say that the abortion industry has engaged in that, if not overt coercion, the subtle coercion in convincing women to abort their children. And okay, let's talk about the abortion distortion. Do you remember these guys?
Yeah.
Isn't he a fine-looking man? According to the ad, he's a doctor, and he's a family man. He's all these things. He's always friendly, and he smokes Camels. And you can even read here that according to a nationwide survey done by the tobacco manufacturer, that more doctors smoke Camel than any other brand. Yeah, and his teeth are unusually white for being a man with white hair who smokes. Anyway. And how about this? Now, there's about 20 pages. There's a website dedicated to the tobacco industry's deception and their marketing ploys. And one of those documents is what you see here. This page that you see here came from a white paper created by the tobacco industry, and it's called A Scientific Perspective on the Cigarette Controversy, Tobacco Industry Research Committee, New York, New York, March 1954. Well, there's about 20 pages of this stuff, and the reason I picked this one, there were other ones that could have served, but I thought this was interesting because we see here that one of the persons being quoted is the Research Studies Section Chief at the federal government's Cancer Control Branch, National Institute of Health. Now, not to be unfair to him, I wanted to get some context to what he says, but you can read that if you like. It says here, this observation strongly militates against a predominant causal role of cigarette smoking in the production of lung cancer. Now, retrospectively, it appears that this gentleman was terribly mistaken. I don't think anybody would say differently. And just because the National Institute of Health and their cadre of doctors and epidemiologists and statisticians say that there is no connection between breast cancer and abortion. I don't think we're obliged to take their word for it. And oh, by the way, it would be helpful if they would be, at least be candid about some of these other studies. So, why do we bother? Well, for me personally, and I would surmise that probably for most of us here, this is one of my favorite verses in all of literature and certainly within Scripture. What a great verse. Teddy Roosevelt was supposed to have inscribed this verse on Bibles that were handed out to soldiers as they left for Europe during World War I. So that's why we do it, because we love the Lord God, we love people, and it's a just and merciful thing to do. If people are being harmed by the suppression and misrepresentation of the data and the science, I think that we as people of conscience, as people of the Lord God, have an obligation to expose it.